Hello, everyone, and this is the Driving the Business of Science podcast. My name is Keith Parent. I'm the CEO of Court Square Group. Um, every month we try, every couple of weeks we try to have a podcast talking about the different aspects of the business aspect of science. Everybody thinks about pharmaceutical development and drug development of the actual scientists doing their work and things like that, but there's so much more that happens around that. Today, we're going to focus in on the concept of effectively selling science, overcoming barriers to growth. And with us, we have Dave Kwajewski, Executive Director of Business Development for Corealis Pharma and the founder of Selling Science. Dave, we'll talk in a few seconds. Let me tell you a little bit about who we are, just so you know where we come from when in the business of science. We are a managed service firm. We manage IT infrastructure for life science companies. What that means is we host and manage the environment all the way from preclinical through manufacturing. Any application that needs to be in a qualified or a validated environment, typically is going to have 21 CFR Part 11 capabilities, and we're going to be able to be compliant with those regulations. You still need all the security and all the access you need in normal environments, but typically it's going to have lots of different applications. We also have a system we call RegDocs 365, which is a content repository for any kind of clinical and regulatory content. We started out with a TMF and EDM reference model, but then we also created what we call Life Science Launchpad for our startup companies. And it's a great way to get them off the ground the right way so that they can scale and grow as they grow as a company and get funding and move on. With that being said, Dave, welcome to the podcast today. Love to hear a little bit more about the selling of science.
Thanks, Keith. I appreciate it. Yeah, so I've been in sales now for 22 and a half years. Started on the bench as a chemist out of college and very quickly realized that, I wanted more. I really wanted more money. That's really what first drove me to sales. And, any salesperson who wants to hide that should be your first red flag that you might have the wrong person, because this game does come down to having a motivation, and, money is a strong motivation, continues to be today, 22 and a half years later. Where that money goes today is a little different than where it went 22 and a half years ago, but the motivation is still there. I can guarantee that. I've spent the majority of my career around small molecule drug development and the technologies and services that support it. And I've found that very fulfilling, and I'm looking forward to this conversation today to shed light on, the history of sales over my last 22 and a half years, but also where we are today and what companies of all sizes can do to get better.
That's fantastic. It's interesting because I'm very involved in our selling of the stuff that we do. As a matter of fact, I'm actually on the West Coast right now. Dave is on the East Coast. It's morning there, but it's very early morning out here on the West Coast. I'm actually going to be going on a floor today at a conference for a clinical trial. Different companies doing that. So I spoke yesterday, and I'm doing that, and we're going to be interacting with customers all day, trying to sell our services and talk to other people. And it's also a way for me to learn about the industry every time I talk to different customers. So I think that's a great thing. Why have you chosen that sales career in the life science, and particularly in the life science? I know that your background seems to stem for that. Tell me what was that trigger? What got you to go into the sales?
I'll come back to the money piece real quick, and then I'll talk about where it's evolved from there. But starting on the bench as a bachelor scientist, you get that first paycheck, your first career, and it's pretty insulting. And I felt that insult when I first saw, how much money I was actually going to take home at the end of the day. And I needed to figure out a way to do more, right? I had bigger ambitions for myself, for my career, for my family life, everything. And so it really was a money motivation that brought me into sales, but it was a scientific motivation that kept me wanting to sell within the scientific space over these last 22 and a half years. I've had opportunities to leave this sector, and, inevitably I've stayed here for all of the right reasons, I feel. My first sales job was quite transactional, selling a piece of equipment that was sort of dictated by the United States pharmacopoeia that everyone had to use as a test, at the end of their solid dose manufacturing process. And so, there was some differentiation with competitors, but it was a transactional type sale. And, back then, I fought to expand my territory for more earning potential. I fought to expand my responsibility set for more earning potential. but inevitably moved on from that for lack of growth. And, the steps I made beyond that, I look at them, now looking back over the 22 and a half years, and they were all in different phases, right? I went from that very transactional, getting my feet wet phase to gaining a better understanding of the industry and sort of learning more about myself and where I wanted to go. And then, ultimately took on a VP of sales role with a small Massachusetts-based company called Pion. And that really helped me understand, a lot of the ins and outs of running a business, running a team, managing people. And inevitably, I made a choice that not a lot of people make. I stepped back into an individual contributor role. I felt like, leading a team and everything had its merits and it had its great moments, but there was a lot of stress and a lot of things that took me away from what I truly loved. And I truly love the direct selling piece. And so that's where I found myself today in the role with Corealis, is in a direct selling role as an individual contributor.
How much do you have to keep up with the science aspect when you go to talk to other scientists? And I'm assuming that's who you sell to. Is that correct? Or do you sell
Yeah.
more to the business units within the companies?
No, throughout my career, my first point of contact within the sales process is the scientist. And, depending on the complexity of what I'm selling, it may be a bench scientist, or it may be somebody at an associate director level. Whether it was necessary or not, I can't speak to, because I've always dug in. I've always gone the extra yard to understand, what comes before me, what comes after me in terms of the development process. How does my technology or service fit? And then, I think that helped round me out as somebody who today is perceived, as much as having a scientific background as having a sales background.
So tell me a little bit about Corealis and your work at Corealis. So it's a name that I don't know that everybody knows that name. So tell me about the Corealis size versus some of the bigger companies that are out there in this space.
Sure. I mean, Corealis is an interesting sales story unto itself, because the company was founded, 20 years ago. In fact, today up in Laval, Canada, Corealis is celebrating their 20-year anniversary as a business. It was founded by three scientists who saw an opportunity in the industry to do something that, was being neglected. And that was early formulation development, primarily targeted at biotech companies who were kind of getting lost in the big boys. The big CDMOs of the space were doing a very good job taking care of large pharma. But the biotech companies felt like, they were getting pushed down the priority line. These, larger organizations weren't moving as fast, weren't making decisions as fast. And so, for a biotech who has one or two assets total in development, meeting timelines and keeping it within budget was of utmost importance. And that's where Corealis thrived. And they did so well as a company that they actually didn't hire sales until they hired me a year and a half ago. So for close to 19 years of their history, they operated without anyone sitting directly in a sales seat. And like you, Keith, their president would attend trade shows, would talk to people, and would sell the brand. And they also benefited from the fact that a biotech company has a certain lifespan, right? A biotech company has an asset that gets developed, and maybe it gets into phase 2 and has a positive readout. That's a great scenario. But beyond that, most biotechs really aren't looking to develop it further. So they're going to either sell or partner the asset off to large pharma. And the CMC team who supported that initiative they're probably on the job market, because if you thrived in a biotech, you're probably not going to thrive in the big pharma acquirer. And on the negative side, if the asset didn't read out well, then that CMC team is also most likely looking for a job. So if you, as the CDMO or any service or technology provider, did right by that customer and met their expectations or exceeded it wherever possible, then when those people go and land somewhere else, they're bringing your good brand with you. And so that kind of organic growth is really what fueled Corealis. So why hire sales a year and a half ago? They doubled their footprint. So they finally got to a point, they operated for the majority of their history with a full factory, so to say. With the doubling their footprint, they finally hit a point in which they needed additional bandwidth on the selling front. And so that's where my role was created and I stepped into last year.
That's fantastic. You're actually filling in the blanks for me a little bit, because I've always wondered, CMC is not an area that I thrive in, and I haven't really done a ton of work with CMC consultants. And I always wonder why I see these different CMC guys out there. And it makes sense now when you talk about the early stage like that, and why they go on from one to another. Either they're going to make it and it's going to grow, or they're going to move on to something else. I met Dave, for everybody to know, I met Dave years ago at the ADDF conference in Boston, and it's one that Dave has been one of the I think you were one of the founders of ADDF, correct? Or
I
you
stepped
popped
into
in?
it early, but I wasn't a founder. I got to give
Okay,
full credit to Shelly and Kevin on that front.
all right. And I've had both Shelly and Kevin on for podcasts in the past, so we've got all the guys that are involved with ADDF. And actually, we're going to have one. We're coming up in December of this year, correct?
Yeah, December 11th is going to be held at the UMass Club in Boston.
That's fantastic. I love
And
that
yeah,
club. That'll
for
be a
those
really
of you who
fun
don't
place.
know, the Advancing Drug Development Forum is taking a slightly different approach this year. So the core meeting is going to operate as usual, but through the influence and feedback of people like myself, but from my customer base through me, we're creating a scientific track in the afternoon that we're looking to draw attention to. And so our focus this year is on beyond rule of 5 drug development. So for those of you who aren't on the science side, there were a set of rules laid out, I think in the mid to late 90s by a scientist at Pfizer, Chris Lipinski. And they were sort of a guideline on how to develop a small molecule oral drug. And, if the drug fit those 5 rules, then the development should be relatively straightforward. Anyone who has any eyes on the industry now knows that the complexity of molecules has increased significantly, and we're looking to deliver more and more complex molecules orally. And so this session that we're running in the afternoon, we're calling it a live lab, is going to include a panel discussion with scientists from Pfizer, Lilly, Atavistic, Veristem. And then we're going to have a technology panel where we're going to get to hear from other suppliers. And then we're going to have a breakout session where we do some real world problem solving. So for anyone in that space, I'd love to, connect with me on LinkedIn. I'd love to tell you more about it.
I think that's fantastic. One of the reasons I like going to a lot of these shows is I get to hear from the industry itself. So I use that as some of my own training. So it's a great way just to figure out what's happening in the industry, what's going on. I'll learn about the rule of 5 because I've never been influenced by the rule of 5. So I'll find out what that's all about and be somewhat knowledgeable when somebody says it, enough to be dangerous anyway. So
buzzword literate.
Great. So tell me how have things changed over the 20 years? You just mentioned that the rule of 5 was kind of the way to do it, but now it's much more complicated for some of the things that are. Tell me how the industry's changed from a selling perspective. I know that you're in it at Corealis for the last year and a half, but you've been doing it for a long time. Tell me about that.
Yeah, it's an amazing evolution, right? I mean, just like everything else we're watching technologically change, rapidly, especially, with AI and everything over the last several years. But, if we look back 22 and a half years ago, when I started my first sales job, I wasn't given a smartphone and Salesforce license. I was given a box of maps and I was given a paper copy and, had an Excel backup of a customer list of the people who own our equipment or other people who have visited us at trade shows. So some of that stuff had been converted digitally, and the company at the time was in the process of actually onboarding a CRM. But the first thing I was handed was literally a cardboard box of maps of New England and New York. To this day, if you tell me the zip code in New York, I can tell you what region it's in because I had to memorize all of the zip codes in order to know where this customer was going and whether or not I could fit in a call in Hauppauge on the same day as I could fit in a call in Syracuse, which you cannot. But yeah, it evolved relatively quickly to smartphones and GPSs but today, let's focus on the selling aspect. That's the logistics of sales. Everyone knows that's changed quite a bit. But how did people view sales? What was sales' role in the technology or service acquisition process? 22 and a half years ago, trade shows were huge, right? PitCon was a gigantic trade show, tens of thousands of people attending. AAPS had, it really just come into its own and was growing very, very fast. Trade shows were where people went for information. And the smaller groups hadn't quite figured out that smaller meeting trade shows could be a business, right? So people only had a certain number of trade shows to choose from. And they all went. All of the scientists, all of the companies would be represented there in a relatively large delegation, and they would be going booth to booth to learn what's new. And as a salesperson, that was a great opportunity to hone your skills in a sort of a rapid fire selling environment, but also it helps you solidify your knowledge of the technology and walking the floors and talking to other vendors and getting in-depth conversations with clients. You really helped build that perspective of what exists in this industry, right? And fast forward to today, salespeople fight for time, right? Fighting for time is, we're fighting against technology. We're fighting against, companies trying to reduce their spend by keeping their employee count low. So it's an amazing change, right? So we go to trade shows now and think of the work we're doing going to a trade show. We're mining the data in all ways, right? Through AI, through programs, through our network, and we're trying to get prearranged meetings going into these things. It's not just show up at the booth and you're going to be flooded by people all day. If you don't do your homework going into these trade shows now, they're a waste of time.
It's interesting you say that, because a couple things came to mind when you were talking about that. I think about some of the shows that I've tried over the years. I've done Interflex in New York City, things like that. It was too technical for the base that we're looking for. I've honed in on the clinical and regulatory aspects of different things, and I go to a lot of those. Then I look at things like Bio IT World, which is much more preclinical focus and different areas. So you start to get a sense of the shows and what they're focused in on and where they go. And well, you're right. There's so many shows you can do. You've got to hone in on certain things, and you've got to hone in on the ones that you think your customer base is going to hone in on. Because if you don't, it's going to be a dry hole, and that's what you want to be able to be very careful about where you go and how you look at what you're doing at those shows. But it's interesting because you mentioned the fact that you now have to data mine and you have to go and try to meet up with people. I've been at a couple shows now where I've heard some of the sponsors that are going to these shows saying that they're getting inundated with people asking them to meet them at the show, and they say, "No, I don't have 5 minutes to meet with you at these things." So I think there's a backlash a little bit coming from some of these people that are getting hounded by people trying to get their time at some of these things. But typically, I've done the speed dating service type of thing where you get the decision makers and you do the speed dating and you do stuff. And then what I've done is also I've had the ones where you go and you're supposed to be doing some of the kind of like that, but nobody shows up, and you get them around a round table. I found, when we looked at stuff, I used to exclusively do shows because it was too tough to do directly into a site. You can't call into any of these places. They don't want to answer the phone or anything.
Yeah.
But however, if they know you or if somebody else refers you, then you're much more likely to get to talk to somebody, and you do it because this industry, while this industry is big, it's really small. Particularly when you look at the different areas, certain scientists are focused on their scientific area. Certain clinical people are focused on clinical area. So it's really these silos of people that do certain things that all work together. And I think that's where it comes in. I used to do all the shows exclusively, but then when COVID hit and we couldn't get together at these shows, it was like, okay, what do we do now? And that's when we started doing more webinars. We started to do more of the podcasts, like this kind of stuff. And what I found was that the social media aspect now and the ability for people to search and find you is much better now, but you got to have a presence out there, and you've got to be able to talk about what you do and be able to get to people differently. So I think that is a really valid point about doing that. I think now people are going back to shows a lot more now, and they want to get back out in there and see people and shake hands and do stuff like that. So there's a nice mix of both that social media aspect and then follow up with people and bringing them out and doing things like that. So that's really
I think it's a nice mix if you're wired like you and me, right? And I think one of the reasons we've got along over these last several years is, I think we're kindred spirits in terms of our approach to sales. Is it's going to take a dog's breakfast of approaches to make it work, and that's fine, because if I had to focus on one thing and one thing only every day, I think I'd lose my mind, right? So there are people out there though who are waiting for that one thing, right? They're waiting for that one approach that's going to solve them all. And they can be done with trade shows, they can be done with social media, they can be done with everything else other than that one thing. And we're evolving that way. I know bigger companies are looking at AI as replacements for sales teams, and I don't think we're that far away from that reality for some of these big companies. I think the points of contact within these organizations, the customer-facing employees, are going to look much different 10 years from now than they look today. I think these, transactional BD type people are largely going to go away, and can be replaced quite quickly by an AI interface that a scientist, and not to generalize, but scientists have a tendency to be more introverted. They'd much rather interact with something that's not going to hound them, that's not going to knock on their door, that's not going to track them down at a trade show, right? So they just want their information, and they want it in the most easy to digest way possible. So
Well, and
I
now
think
instead of having a
there's
chatbot,
changes coming.
and now instead of having a chatbot, you can actually have an AI image of somebody actually talking back and forth to you and be able to do that stuff. So, and you're right. I think some of these scientists would rather have a discussion with a computer than with a person,
Yeah.
because they can ask whatever kind of weird question. What do you think people are doing wrong in sales today, and how, and what do you see that changing?
So I think a lot of the issues in sales today, obviously our industry, I come from an early development space, right? So the early development space in the wake of COVID, it had a huge surge within COVID. Everyone was developing any molecule they could get their hands on, and companies like Corealis and other companies who had a focus on discovery and early development did very well through that phase. We're now in the aftermath of that, right? I mean, I think we've come down off the sugar high significantly. Investment is way down in the early development space. If you look at total numbers of investment dollars, it's getting back up there, but a lot of that is being used to advance later stage assets. So what are companies doing wrong? They're getting distracted by external influences, I think. I think they're looking at macro or geopolitical or private equity based influences in their sphere, and they're taking their eye off the ball. And sometimes you can't help it, right? Sometimes those pressures and influences are so great that they're whether or not you as an employee survive, or whether your division or whether your company survives, right? I mean, it can be that life or death for some of these organizations, that you kind of have to bow to the ones controlling the organization. But I guess if there's people like that out there, that my advice to them is, gain a broader perspective of what's going on. And while we all want more sales, what I created the consulting company Selling Science, as you mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, to try to help organizations realize that more sales, while it may seem like it solves the short-term problems of your organization, is not putting yourself in a better position to grow. Right? That if you want to position your company to grow, you actually have to solve some of the problems that exist within your selling process. And in my opinion, a lot of that starts with arbitrary metrics, right? It's just, we need to make X number of cold calls, X number of client visits, X number of this a week, because that's what I did at my previous place, or that's what I learned at, this big company. I've always worked for small companies, right? This is my fourth job where I've been the first sales hire in the history of the organization, right? So a lot of it's just been creation, right? So I think where a lot of companies are getting it wrong is just forcing their expectations are not aligned with the realities of the market, and they're putting pressures on their sales team to perform in ways that are unrealistic. I think that's where most companies are failing. Where smaller companies need to be focused today is where their strengths are, which is speed and innovation. And the minute you as a smaller company take on this big company culture and paralyze yourself, you're going to lose the game of bandwidth, because you're never going to compete with the bandwidth of the big guys. And then you're going to lose the game of speed and innovation, because you've just crippled your team with a culture that belongs at a several thousand employee company, not a 10-person company. So that's what I'm seeing out there is, there's a lot of pressure on sales because the numbers haven't been fantastic. A lot of companies are, especially in the early development space, are not crushing it. And so, everyone is out there fighting for what is available, and, not everyone's going to win. And, when you see a salesperson's track record of being 9 to 15 months at the last 4 or 5 organizations, you used to be able to say that that person's just not a good salesperson. But these days, they might just have made some really bad choices of who to go work for.
Yeah. Some companies don't even last that long, right? I mean, it's interesting when you see how, I talk to people in the clinical space, and it's funny how many have been laid off or things like that. We actually had a session yesterday where I was talking about, even from an FDA perspective, FDA and NIH, when I was at the DIA Global event in June down in DC, it's amazing how many FDA people were laid off, and they were looking to say, hey, am I going to even stay in this industry anymore?
Right.
So those are things that you start to think about. Well, as we're coming up on time here, Dave, it's been a fantastic conversation. I think that one of the takeaways that I've got from this is I think that, and I'm old school, so I'm still going to want to shake hands. I'm still going to want to go see people. I still want to be able to look them in the eye and show them that what we're going to do and how we're going to make things right when things break and all that stuff, because everything does. It's just the way it is, because we work in IT. So and then the same thing happens with in the science aspect of things. Not everything works as you think it's going to work. So what do you do?
It's research, right?
So right, it's research. So with that being said, give us some final thoughts on from your aspects on selling into the science world.
Yeah, I guess the biggest thing is, take the time to understand where your sales problems are coming from. If you're having sales problems, hiring more bad salespeople doesn't solve your sales problem, right? It may look good. It may be what your board wants you to do because everyone has comfort in numbers, but it's not going to help you long term. And if you're the leader of a company, lead it, right? And being a leader means to understand what's in front of you and how to make the best of the team you have. But in building that team, hire smart, hire slow. Don't just go out there, put a rec out for 4 salespeople and take the first 4 resumes that come across your desk. I mean, you're setting yourself up for an incredible amount of frustration, and you're probably setting these poor people up who are taking the job. You're setting them up for failure. My advice to people on the bench, if there's anyone who, has influence over somebody who's on the bench and looking to get into business development, I'll say it's been the most fantastic choice of my life, right? I've built an incredible network. I've gained an unbelievable perspective of our industry as a whole. I've dug in really deep on some, aspects of science that I never would have seen otherwise, but it isn't for everyone. It's hard. It's competitive. It takes you away from home, probably more than most people want to be away. And so, my advice is if you're thinking about moving from the bench to a sales or business development role is, make sure you have a complete understanding of the expectations that are going to be in front of you. Lean on your network. If you don't have a great network, start building a great network today that'll carry you for the rest of your career. But lean on that network so that they can help you understand some of the hidden things that may sneak up and lead to your success or failure. So I guess on both fronts, do your due diligence, put in the work, and you as a leader of a company or you as a salesperson will benefit from it.
Well, you're so right. I think about the network that we talk about, different people and getting to know different people. And you and I have seen a lot of people at the same events. We'll go to different events. Like we were recently at that event out in Boston where you're in biotech and you go out and you meet all these different guys that are starting up these companies. People don't value that enough. And I think that that's a huge thing. And being able to have other people in your network that can send out an email for you. It's amazing how a warm referral from somebody else, it just opens doors like that. So
Oh, yeah.
I 100% agree with you that
I could do another
on your
25
network.
minutes on the tactics of selling, but maybe some other time.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Again, this has been Driving the Business of Science podcast. Dave, has been an awesome time with you. Thank you very much. Have a great day. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Thanks, Keith.